Welcome to the deep dive. I am just so glad you brought us this stack of sources today. You've really handed us a fascinating challenge this time.
Oh, I know. It's essentially a masterclass in ultimate logic and metaphysical gymnastics.
Yeah, it's definitely one way to put it, because today we are looking at excerpts from really one of the most intensely analyzed texts in all of Western history, Thomas Aquinas and his Summa Theologica.
Specifically, we are diving right into the third part. We're examining the foundational arguments that deal with his treatise on the Incarnation.
Right, which is a massive topic. So just to set the stage for you listening, our mission today is to extract the rigorous, almost mathematical framework that Aquinas uses to explain what is, arguably the ultimate paradox.
Exactly. We are analyzing how he logically structures this concept of an infinite, limitless, completely unchangeable reality, God becoming a finite, limited, material human being.
And I want to establish our parameters right off the bat here. Regardless of your personal worldview, whether you approach this material as a devout theologian or a strict empiricist or literally anywhere in between, this text fundamentally shaped the way Western philosophy handles complex definitions.
Oh, absolutely. It deals with substance, nature, essence. It's monumental intellectual architecture.
So we are essentially stepping into the machinery of his thought process today. We are going to impartially report on the internal logic of this highly intricate system.
And our goal is to map out how meticulously Aquinas balances these massive competing concepts. Things like perfect justice, infinite mercy, boundless existence, and severe human limitation.
All without allowing the system to collapse in on itself into some sort of glaring contradiction, which is no small feat.
No, it
Yeah.
really isn't it. And if you are asking yourself right now why you should invest time into a medieval philosophical text, especially in our current era of constant information overload and frequently sloppy public discourse, the answer is incredibly practical.
It's like going to the mental gym.
That's exactly it. Reading Aquinas is like putting your brain through high-intensity interval training. He teaches you how to define your terms with excruciating precision.
Yeah, and he demonstrates how to anticipate your opponent's strongest counter-arguments before they even articulate them.
Right. He shows you how to build a conceptual framework so sturdy that removing even one piece requires addressing the entire structure. Plus, it delves into this deeply compelling philosophical problem of bridging the gap between an eternal static realm and the messy, decaying material world we actually occupy.
Okay, let's unpack this. Before we get into the actual arguments about infinite beings and finite bodies, I think we have to look at his specific method.
The scholastic method, yes. The way Aquinas writes totally dictates how this entire intellectual edifice is constructed.
Because he doesn't write persuasive essays. He doesn't write flowing narratives. He follows a very strict format.
Right. For every single issue he tackles, he begins by isolating a highly specific question. And then he immediately lists the absolute best objections against the very position he is about to defend.
He essentially builds the strongest possible case for his critics first, which is wild when you think about it.
It demonstrates a supreme level of intellectual confidence. You hand the microphone to your detractors, you let them construct the most devastating arguments against your premise, and you actually help them refine those arguments until they are razor sharp.
Yeah, you make their arguments better than they could make them themselves.
Exactly. And only after setting up those formidable hurdles does he provide his own synthesis. That's the famous "I answer that" section. Then he circles back and systematically dismantles those initial objections one by one, using the new definitions he just established.
Which brings us perfectly to the very first hurdle he sets up for himself in question 1. He asks a foundational question about fittingness. Was it actually fitting for God to become incarnate?
And the objections he engineers against his own premise here are genuinely difficult to dismiss. They are heavy hitters.
The first objection attacks the concept of change itself, because God is defined from eternity as the very essence of goodness and absolute perfection.
Right. And the trap here is that if a being is already completely perfect, any alteration, any movement, or any change is by definition a downgrade.
Like if you have a perfect circle, any modification to that line just makes it less of a circle.
Exactly. Therefore, why would a perfect, unchanging entity alter its state by taking on physical flesh? It logically doesn't make sense.
And then the second objection focuses on the sheer infinite distance between the two natures involved. How do you logically unite two things that exist on absolute opposite ends of reality?
This is where Aquinas brings in a really striking image from the Roman poet Horace. Horace wrote about the absurdity of painting a picture where the neck of a horse is grafted onto the head of a human man.
It's just a grotesque, unnatural combination.
Right, it's aesthetically and logically offensive. The argument is that the divine nature is totally simple, completely uncomposed, and purely spiritual, whereas human flesh is highly composite, complex, and physical. Jamming them together seems absurd.
Then there is the hierarchy of being. That's the third objection, which argues that a physical, material body is as distant from the highest spiritual reality as absolute evil is from the highest good.
Right, so since God occupies the apex of the highest good, assuming a physical, earthly body seems not just unfitting, but fundamentally inappropriate.
It would be like a sovereign monarch choosing to govern their massive, beautiful empire from the bottom of a muddy ditch.
That is a perfect way to visualize it, and that leads directly into the logistical nightmare of the fourth objection.
Oh, right. The active governor of the entire cosmos. If God is sustaining every star and planet in existence every single millisecond, how does that infinite ruler localize into a tiny, frail infant?
Doesn't the rest of the universe fall into complete chaos if the prime mover is suddenly constrained to a cradle in a remote province?
It's such a good question. So what's fascinating here is how Aquinas escapes this corner, because he really painted himself into one.
He really did. But he doesn't do it by shrinking the concept of God to fit the human container. Rather, he totally redefines our understanding of goodness itself.
He pulls from the philosophical tradition of Dionysius here, right?
Yes, Dionysius argued that goodness, by its fundamental nature, is communicative. It is inherently diffusive. Think of a powerful light source.
The nature of light is not to contain itself.
Right. Its nature is to radiate outward, illuminating whatever is around it. Goodness does not hoard itself.
So goodness is an active, outward-flowing reality, rather than a static object just sitting in a vault.
Yes. Aquinas takes that premise and pushes it to its absolute logical limit. If the defining characteristic of the highest good is to communicate itself, then the highest good must communicate itself in the absolute highest, most intimate manner possible to the creature.
And the ultimate form of communication isn't just sending a message through a prophet. It's not just giving a gift or sending a rule book.
No, the ultimate form of self-communication is actually uniting with the creature so intimately that they become one person. Therefore, the incarnation isn't some absurd anomaly. It is the logical climax of what supreme goodness naturally does.
Wow. Okay, that entirely reframes the discussion. But he still has to address those specific traps he set for himself. How does he handle the first objection, the idea that a perfect being cannot change without suffering a downgrade?
He resolves the trap by isolating where the change actually occurs. He clarifies that the union didn't involve God altering his eternal state. The divine nature remained completely immutable and perfectly simple.
So God didn't change.
Exactly. Instead, the change happened entirely on the side of the creature. The human nature was the thing that was elevated, drawn up, and united to the divine in a completely novel way. God didn't morph into a human. Rather, a human nature was assumed by God.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about Horace's horseneck analogy? The idea that the two natures are just way too incongruous to ever combine.
He concedes a crucial point there. If you are looking purely at the natural capacities of human nature, such a union is absolutely impossible. It vastly exceeds human dignity and physical limitation.
A piece of clay can't naturally become the potter.
Right. However, the union isn't driven by the capacities of the finite material. It is driven by the infinite power of the highest good. The union is initiated from the top down, meaning the infinite has the power to bridge a gap that the finite could never cross on its own.
I find his counter to the logistical objection, the idea of the ruler of the universe abandoning his post to become an infant, to be incredibly elegant.
It's one of his best analogies. He draws on Augustine to explain that God's greatness isn't a matter of physical mass or spatial dimension.
Right, God is not a giant physical object taking up space in the sky.
Exactly. God's greatness is a matter of pure might and power. He uses this profound analogy of a spoken word to demonstrate omnipresence.
The spoken word analogy, yes. Let's break that down.
If I speak a sentence right now, you hear the entire sentence. If we were in a massive auditorium with 10,000 people, every single person would hear that exact same word in its entirety at the exact same moment.
The spoken word isn't sliced into 10,000 tiny fragments, so everyone just gets a little piece of a syllable.
Exactly. The full reality of the word is present to everyone simultaneously. By applying that analogy, Aquinas argues that the eternal Word of God can be completely wholly present within a localized human body, while remaining simultaneously and completely present everywhere else, sustaining the entire universe.
That completely shatters the assumption that an infinite being is bound by spatial geometry. It's brilliant.
Having established that this union is fitting according to the nature of goodness, the internal logic of the Summa naturally progresses to the next hurdle.
Question 1, Article 2. Was it necessary? Did this specific method absolutely have to be the way the human race was restored?
And this brings up an incredibly vital distinction in his framework. He parses out the definition of the word necessity into two distinct categories.
The food versus the horse. I love this part.
It's so helpful. First, something can be necessary in the way that food is necessary to maintain human life. If you do not eat, you will die. The end goal is strictly impossible without that specific mechanism.
Right. And the second type of necessity is entirely different. It's like needing a horse for a long journey.
Yes, you don't strictly need the horse to reach your destination. You could walk. It is physically possible to get there on foot. However, the horse makes the journey significantly better, more efficient, and more fitting to the traveler.
So when Aquinas applies this distinction to the question of whether the incarnation was necessary to save humanity from its fallen state, he firmly rejects the food type of necessity.
He does. Within this theological system, God possesses total omnipotence. God could have restored human nature, forgiven every debt, and fixed the universe with a single formless thought from heaven. There was no strict binding limitation forcing this exact outcome.
But he argues it was profoundly necessary in the horse sense. It was the absolute best, most effective, and most beneficial method to achieve the ultimate goal for humanity.
Exactly. And he builds out this concept by detailing 5 specific ways this method provided a furtherance in good for the human species. These aren't just abstract theological concepts either. They're deeply psychological.
Right, let's look at the first furtherance. It's about faith. If the goal is for humans to have certain unwavering belief in the divine, it is infinitely more effective when the divine speaks to you directly.
Face to face.
Yes, embedded in your own reality. Rather than transmitting dictates through a long chain of angelic messengers or human prophets, it anchors epistemological certainty in a tangible, historical reality.
The second furtherance addresses hope. In a framework where humans are acutely aware of their own frailty and the vast, intimidating perfection of the Creator, hope can easily falter.
It's terrifying, honestly.
It is. But nothing secures psychological hope quite like seeing the infinite Creator actually take on the fragile, limited condition of the creature. It provides an undeniable proof of profound investment. It bridges that massive chasm between the intimidating eternal judge and the struggling human condition.
And then the third furtherance naturally follows, which is charity or love.
Aquinas relies heavily on Augustine here, noting that an act of such immense condescension and solidarity is specifically designed to enkindle a reciprocal love.
The idea being that if humanity had been sluggish or indifferent in its affection toward an invisible, abstract deity, witnessing the Creator assume the vulnerabilities of a human life should act as a massive catalyst. It prompts an immediate, effective response.
The fourth point shifts into the realm of ethics and daily living. It concerns well-doing. A purely spiritual, invisible God cannot provide a visible blueprint for human behavior in physical, everyday situations.
Right, God doesn't have a body to show you how to act when someone steals your coat.
Precisely. By living a localized temporal life, this method provides a tangible, observable exemplar. Humans learn best by mirroring. Having a visible standard of virtue operating under the exact same physical constraints makes the pursuit of the good practical rather than merely theoretical.
And then the fifth furtherance represents the absolute summit of his entire system, the full participation of humanity in the divine life, the concept of deification.
He quotes Augustine again here with a phrase that really serves as the keystone for this entire architectural structure. God was made man, that man might be made God.
Now we should clarify, it doesn't mean humans become omnipotent creators of universes.
No, not at all. It means that human nature is elevated to participate intimately in the divine nature. The incarnation is the literal conduit through which that elevation occurs.
But Aquinas doesn't just look at the positive trajectory. He balances the equation by showing how this method simultaneously provides a withdrawal from evil.
Yes, it serves as a comprehensive defense mechanism for the human psyche. First, it completely undercuts the temptation to elevate spiritual beings like angels or even demonic forces above humanity.
Because humanity had a habit of worshiping anything invisible and powerful.
Exactly. By uniting specifically with human nature, the system declares that human nature, not angelic nature, holds a unique, exalted primacy.
So it reorients human dignity. If you understand that your specific physical and rational nature is the very nature assumed by the Creator, you have a profound inherent reason not to degrade or sully that nature through destructive actions or sin.
It acts as a massive bulwark against nihilism and self-destruction. Furthermore, it acts as the ultimate cure for the root of all human failure in this framework, which is pride.
The ultimate disease.
Right. If the disease is human arrogance trying to grasp at divinity, the specific medicine applied is the Creator displaying the ultimate staggering humility by embracing physical limitation, suffering, and mortality. It neutralizes pride by providing an overwhelming counterexample.
And finally, the withdrawal from evil touches on the actual mechanics of justice. In his system, the debt incurred by human rebellion against an infinite good is essentially infinite.
A finite human being, left entirely to their own devices, simply lacks the capital, the capacity to satisfy an infinite debt.
It's like trying to pay off a $1 trillion mortgage with a jar of pennies. On the flip side, God possesses the infinite capacity to pay the debt, but God is not the one who owes it.
Therefore, a being who is both fully human and fully divine presents an incredibly elegant, mathematically sound solution. As man, the being owes the debt and can legitimately act on behalf of the human race. As God, the being possesses the infinite dignity required to actually satisfy it.
Within the variables Aquinas has defined, this mechanism perfectly resolves the competing demands of absolute justice, which requires the debt to be paid, and absolute mercy, which desires the restoration of the debtor.
And again, evaluating this structurally, you can see how tightly every concept interconnects. You don't even have to adopt the metaphysical premise of original sin to appreciate the sheer logical rigor required to balance an infinite offense with a finite capacity, arriving at a solution that satisfies both without compromising the defined nature of either.
That beautiful balance of justice and mercy actually raises a fascinating hypothetical, and this is question 1, article 3.
The great what if.
Yes. If he has established that the incarnation is the perfect remedy for the fall of humanity, what happens to the system if you remove the fall entirely? If humanity had never rebelled, if that infinite debt never existed in the first place, would God still have taken on human form?
This is truly one of the most compelling counterfactuals in the entire Summa. And Aquinas is very transparent that this was a subject of active, heated debate among theologians of his own era.
He lays out the objections, which argue very persuasively that the incarnation would have happened regardless of human sin.
The logic is really strong. They argue human nature is fundamentally capable of being united to the divine, as evidenced by the fact that it eventually happened. Furthermore, God's predestination and grand design for the universe operate from eternity. They shouldn't be contingent upon or purely reactive to human failure.
It seems like a downgrade to say God's masterpiece was just a backup plan.
Exactly. There is also an aesthetic and metaphysical argument embedded in those objections. The incarnation represents the absolute perfection of the universe, forming an unbroken metaphysical chain linking the lowest material elements, dust, flesh, and blood, directly to the highest, uncreated spiritual reality.
It completes the circle of being.
Surely, the argument goes, an all-wise creator would intend to perfect the universe in this manner, regardless of whether humans behaved perfectly or failed miserably.
So, with such a strong case for the yes column, how does he eventually resolve the tension?
He returns to the foundational epistemology of his system. He draws a hard line regarding things that spring purely from the free will of God, actions that go beyond what is naturally owed to a creature by its very nature.
Right.
He argues that human reason can deduce certain things about God logically, but for actions that depend solely on divine choice, we are entirely reliant on what has been explicitly revealed in the source material, which is Scripture.
And when he examines the scriptural text, the incarnation is uniformly, everywhere, framed explicitly as a rescue mission.
It is consistently presented as a specific medicine applied to a specific disease.
He leans on a very pragmatic commentary on the book of Timothy to solidify this. The commentary basically states, take away diseases, take away wounds, and there is no need of medicine.
It is a profound boundary he sets on theological speculation. He fully acknowledges that God's power is limitless. God certainly could have become incarnate in a universe where sin never existed. The mechanism itself is not dependent on sin.
But the actual historical reason revealed in the text is exclusively to remedy the fall.
Yes. If humans had not sinned, they would have been endowed with the natural wisdom and grace appropriate to their state. The incarnation in this specific historical iteration was God stooping down to the corporeal, painful level precisely because humanity had plunged itself to that level.
This philosophical concession, that an ultimate good was deployed specifically in response to an ultimate failure, introduces a concept that carries immense philosophical weight. It is the idea of the felix culpa, or the happy fault.
Yes, oh happy fault that merited such and so great a redeemer. Aquinas explores the profound paradox that God permits evils to occur within the system, precisely to extract an even greater unforeseen good from them.
It's a grand calculus.
In the framework, the initial fall of humanity was a catastrophic tragedy, yet it occasioned an intervention, a union of humanity and divinity, that elevated the human species to a state of participation in the divine life far surpassing the original innocence they lost.
The fault becomes happy because the resulting architecture is infinitely more glorious than the unbroken original would have been.
It is a staggering framework for processing negative events. But analyzing this disease in medicine analogy naturally pushes the inquiry deeper into the nature of the disease itself.
Right, which brings us to Article 4. If the incarnation is medicine for sin, which specific iteration of sin was the primary target?
Did God take on flesh primarily to eradicate actual sin, the deliberate, daily infractions committed by individual people? Or original sin, the inherited systemic fracture in human nature itself?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the tension here hinges on how you measure severity. On one hand, actual sins seem far more grievous and offensive to a perfect system because they are active, voluntary choices made by a rational agent.
Right. Original sin, within this paradigm, carries the lightest punitive weight precisely because it is an inherited state. It's not an active, personal choice of the individual suffering under it. Logically, you would assume the ultimate physician came to treat the most severe, willful rebellion.
So how does Aquinas dismantle that assumption?
He introduces a vital distinction between two ways something can be considered great. He calls them intensive greatness and extensive greatness.
Let's define those.
Intensively, meaning in its localized, concentrated severity, actual sin is indeed worse because of the voluntary malice involved. You might imagine a severe, concentrated third-degree burn on a specific patch of your arm. It is intensely damaging to that local area.
Okay, that's intensive. What about extensive?
Extensively, meaning in its sheer scope, reach, and spread, original sin is infinitely greater because it infects the absolute totality of the human race. It is a systemic flaw built into the code of the entire species. Imagine a subtle, low-grade genetic mutation that affects every single cell in your body and the bodies of every human being who will ever exist.
The localized burn versus the universal genetic flaw, that clarifies the target perfectly.
From there, he draws on Aristotle's ethics to lock in the conclusion. Aristotle argued that the good of a multitude, the good of the race, is a more divine and fundamental thing than the good of a single individual.
Healing the foundational root disease of the entire human species is a far greater, more comprehensive act than addressing individual localized symptoms.
Therefore, while Aquinas affirms the incarnation provides sufficient medicine for all types of human failure, its primary driving purpose was the extensive universal reality of original sin.
Which leads us to a fascinating logistical problem within his system. If the problem is universal and the medicine is perfect, we have to look at the timing of the intervention. Why did it happen when it did?
This is question 1, Articles 5 and 6. It tackles this chronological puzzle head-on.
The first logical question is, if humanity contracted this fatal systemic disease at the very dawn of its existence, why didn't the physician administer the cure immediately? I mean, if someone you love falls into a well, you don't wait 3,000 years to pull them out. A perfectly charitable being would surely act without delay.
That objection sounds incredibly modern, doesn't it? It attacks the benevolence of the system based on the perceived delay in aid. But Aquinas leans back into the medical analogy to explain the deep psychology behind the timing.
The patient has to know they're sick.
Exactly. If a physician aggressively forces a powerful, radical treatment on a patient before the patient even recognizes they are ill, the patient will almost certainly reject the medicine. They might even view the intervention as an unprovoked attack. The core disease of humanity in this system was pride, the arrogant belief in self-sufficiency.
If the remedy had been applied the very instant the fall occurred, humanity would never have grasped the catastrophic depth of its own infirmity. They would have assumed they could have fixed it themselves eventually.
Exactly. The system required humanity to be thoroughly humbled by its own chronic failure. God first allowed humanity to operate under the natural law, the inherent moral compass written into human reason.
And when they failed there,
When human societies repeatedly collapsed under the natural law, They were given the written law, specifically the Mosaic Code. The written law provided explicit, unmistakable boundaries.
And when humanity inevitably failed to uphold even the clear written dictates, the severity of the disease was fully undeniably manifest.
The patient had to hit rock bottom. Humanity had to exhaust every possible avenue of self-salvation so that it would finally recognize its total inability to cure itself and organically cry out for a physician.
It is a macro-level psychological argument applied to the entire timeline of human history. And he also introduces a concept about the natural progression of reality.
He observes that the natural order of the universe invariably progresses from the imperfect to the perfect. The seed precedes the massive oak tree. The foundation precedes the completed cathedral.
The Apostle Paul noted that the earthly, physical reality comes first, and the heavenly, spiritual reality follows.
Right. It would violate the established rhythm of existence to deploy the ultimate perfect culmination of human history at the very beginning of the timeline. Furthermore, Aquinas notes the sheer, staggering dignity of the incarnate Word. A minor emissary might arrive unannounced, but the supreme judge, the king of the cosmos, requires a long, extensive line of heralds, prophets, and historical precursors to prepare the way, signaling the immense gravity of the event that is about to unfold.
Okay, so if an immediate intervention would have been rejected by human pride, the logical alternative is to ask, why not wait until the absolute end of the timeline?
Right, Article 6.
If the entire point is to demonstrate ultimate mercy to a sick and failing humanity, wouldn't the most effective strategy be to wait until the very end of the world so every single generation could witness the culmination simultaneously?
Waiting too long introduces a fatal risk: total, irreversible corruption. Aquinas argues that the incarnation had to occur in what he calls the midst of the years.
Why the middle?
Because if the divine intervention had been delayed until the final curtain of human history, all knowledge of the Creator, all foundational reverence, and all upright moral structures would have been completely swept away from the earth by the compounding entropy of human failing.
He paints a very bleak picture of a species suffering from collective amnesia.
He does. He analyzes the historical trajectory, arguing that by the time the incarnation actually occurred, humanity's innate knowledge was growing dangerously dim, and societal morals had become exceedingly lax.
The Gentiles were largely ignoring the dictates of the natural law, and the populations that had received the explicit written law were failing to keep it.
The patient was crashing. It was the precise, optimal moment for a radical intervention, before the spiritual life of the species flatlined entirely. Furthermore, placing the event in the center of history allowed the mechanism of faith to operate bidirectionally.
It looks backward in time for us today, but it also functioned by looking forward in anticipation for those who lived before the event. It securely anchors the intervention in the center of the human narrative. Here's where it gets really interesting. We have spent considerable time parsing the why and the when. We are now shifting gears into question 2, the most technically demanding part of his framework: the how.
The metaphysical mechanics of the union.
Exactly. How exactly do you take two completely contradictory natures, the infinite, uncaused divine and the finite, created human, and fuse them together without destroying one or the other?
This is where Aquinas' precision is genuinely breathtaking. He begins by asking a fundamental question: did this union take place in the nature?
To navigate this, we must first rigorously define what the word nature means in scholastic philosophy, because it is not referring to trees, rivers, or the environment.
It is a very specific technical term. Nature, in this context, refers to the essence, the defining what it is of a given species. It is the quiddity. For example, the nature of a human being is rational animality, a physical body animated by a rational intellect.
And the nature of God is uncreated, absolute perfection.
The question is, did these two radically different natures combine to form one brand new hybrid nature? Aquinas unequivocally says no, and he systematically proves this by examining the physical world, identifying the only 3 ways distinct things can combine, and demonstrating why every single physical method fails metaphysically.
We have to walk through these 3 methods because they perfectly illustrate the boundaries of his logic. What is the first way physical things combine, and why does it fail to explain the incarnation?
The first method is combining things by order or spatial arrangement. Think of a heap of stones or bricks stacked together to build a wall. You take separate pieces and place them next to each other.
Okay, so why does that fail?
It fails as a model for the incarnation because the resulting unity is purely accidental and superficial. A brick wall isn't a single, absolutely unified organism. It's just a collection of distinct parts occupying adjacent space. If the incarnation functioned like this, God and the human nature would merely be glued together, walking side by side. They would not be truly one entity.
If physical proximity doesn't work, what about chemical combinations? The second method is a mixture.
Exactly. Mixing elements, like pouring a drop of fresh water into a massive vat of wine. This model fails for two critical reasons. First, the divine nature is fundamentally immutable. It cannot be altered, diminished, or changed. In any chemical mixture, both original components must change their properties to create a third synthesized substance.
Why? And the second reason?
Second, if you attempt to mix something that is strictly infinite with something that is finite, the infinite component will instantaneously and completely absorb the finite one. The drop of water ceases to exist as water. It is entirely overwhelmed by the wine. If this mixture model were true, the human nature would be swallowed up by the divine infinity, and the resulting being would not be genuinely human at all.
So if physical mixing destroys the components, what about the way our own human bodies are put together? The union of a spiritual soul and physical matter? Does he explore that form and matter relationship as a potential blueprint?
He does, and he rejects it just as firmly. In human beings, the soul acts as the form that animates the physical matter of the body. They don't mix into a smoothie, but they combine essentially to create the human species.
Why does that fail as a theological model?
Because the infinite divine nature cannot serve as the animating form of a physical limited body. If the divine nature acted merely as the form for a human body, that specific animating form could theoretically be applied to multiple different bodies simultaneously, which would mean you could have dozens of distinct Christs walking around. Furthermore, if they combined like form and matter, the resulting being wouldn't exist purely in human nature, nor purely in divine nature, but would constitute an entirely new alien species.
The boundaries are set. The conclusion is that within this framework, the union absolutely did not happen in the nature. The two natures, divine and human, must remain 100% distinct, unmixed, unchanged, and uncompromised.
But if they don't unite in the nature, they have to unite somewhere.
Which forces the logical progression to the next inquiry, Article 2. Did the union take place in the person?
To answer this, we have to endure another rigorous definition check. We have to separate the concept of person from the concept of nature, which is difficult because in our everyday experience, they seem absolutely identical.
They really do.
In material beings like us, the abstract nature of humanity and the concrete person of you or me are distinct philosophical concepts. Aquinas adopts the definition formulated by the philosopher Boethius.
Yeah.
A person is an individual substance of a rational nature. It is the distinct acting agent that exists in and of itself.
So if you picture this, human nature doesn't exist as a floating, abstract cloud in the sky. You cannot point to a generic humanity sitting on a park bench. You only ever interact with a specific human. The nature of humanity only possesses actual reality when it exists in a specific person.
That distinction is the absolute crux of the entire metaphysical mystery. The human nature that the eternal Word of God assumed did not possess its own separate pre-existing human personality.
The incarnation was not a scenario where a pre-existing human guy was living his life, and then the divine nature suddenly invaded his body and co-piloted his mind.
No, not at all. Rather, from the microscopic instant of conception, that newly formed specific human nature was perfectly united to and only ever existed in the eternal, pre-existing person of the Word.
The person is the anchor point. The divine person, the acting agent, eternally holds his own divine nature. At the incarnation, that exact same divine person assumes and holds a complete human nature. Because both distinct natures are anchored to the exact same acting agent, the union takes place flawlessly in the person.
Which naturally leads us to question 2, Article 3. Did the union take place in the suppositum or hypostasis?
Those sound like incredibly intimidating, dense academic terms, but are they basically just refining the concept of person we just established?
They're essentially doing exactly that, but with the necessary Greek terminology that dominated the early church councils. Hypostasis roughly translates to an individual subsisting reality, a particular substance in its complete standalone existence.
And a person.
A person is simply a hypostasis that happens to possess a rational intellect. So asking if the union happened in the hypostasis is confirming the previous point, but doing so with laser-focused precision, specifically to refute one of the most significant historical deviations in theology.
He is targeting the heresy of Nestorianism here. We need to explain why Nestorius thought what he did, because it actually sounds like a very reasonable, logical attempt to protect the dignity of God.
Nestorius was deeply concerned about protecting the unchangeable perfection of the divine. He basically argued that you have the complete hypostasis of God on one side and a completely separate hypostasis of a human man on the other.
Two completely separate
He
subjects.
theorized that these two distinct persons were simply joined together by a perfect union of intention, will, or dignity. Imagine two best friends who are so deeply aligned that they agree on absolutely everything and act in perfect unison.
But Aquinas points out the fatal flaw in that best friends model. If there are two separate acting agents, two hypostases, then the communication of actions breaks down entirely.
It shatters the theology.
If the human person is the one hanging on a cross, you cannot truthfully say God suffered and died. You are only talking about the human friend enduring the pain, while the divine friend observes. But the central stabilizing pillar of this entire theological system is that God intimately experienced the depths of human life and suffering.
Therefore, the union must be anchored in a single, solitary hypostasis. By uniting in one hypostasis, the actions of the human nature, breathing, walking, suffering, weeping, are genuinely and truly the actions of the one person, the Word of God.
The hypostasis is the definitive who that is acting. In this framework, Christ possesses two whats, the divine and human natures, but only one single who, the hypostasis.
It is the only logical configuration that safeguards the core premise without destroying the definitions of the components. But having built this incredibly tight matrix of nature, person, and hypostasis, Aquinas immediately begins to stress test the system with advanced troubleshooting.
He introduces paradoxes that seem to break his own rules. Article 4 asks, is the person of Christ composite?
This is a highly dangerous question within classical theism. One of the absolute, non-negotiable rules of this philosophical tradition is divine simplicity. God is perfectly simple, meaning God has no parts, no divisions, and no composition.
Because if God were made of parts, whoever put those parts together would have to be greater than God.
Exactly. So how can Aquinas possibly entertain the idea that the person of Christ is composite made of parts without destroying the foundational rule of God's simplicity?
How does he manage to maintain divine simplicity while acknowledging the addition of a human nature?
He resolves the paradox by creating a vital distinction based on aspect, the angle from which you view the subject. He argues that if you view the person of the Word in and of itself, looking purely at its eternal reality, it remains perfectly, unbrokenly simple. It is entirely identical with the simple divine nature.
Okay, that covers the eternal side.
However, if you shift your aspect and view the person in terms of its subsistence, meaning how that person exists and operates after the incarnation occurs, it can be described as composite. Why? Because that one indivisible, simple person is now subsisting or living out its existence in two completely different natures.
We can visualize this using the analogy of theater. Imagine a single, distinct actor who is playing two completely different complex roles on stage at the exact same time. The actor themselves, the core person, remains a single, simple human being. But their presentation, their subsistence on the stage in front of the audience, is composite because they're holding two different realities simultaneously.
The composition doesn't violate the eternal divine nature. The composition exists solely in the number of natures the single person is now actively holding. It is a brilliant pivot.
But the stress testing continues in Article 5. Is there a union of soul and body in Christ?
Now, at first glance, the objection he raises here seems to catch him in a contradiction based on the exact rules we just spent time establishing.
Right. The objection points out that in the natural order, the very moment a human soul and a human body unite, they automatically and instantly form a distinct human person.
But we just established beyond a shadow of a doubt that Christ cannot be a newly created human person. He is the eternal, pre-existing divine person.
So if a human soul and a human body unite within him, wouldn't that natural process accidentally generate a second person, throwing us right back into the Nestorian error of having two persons?
It is a devastatingly logical objection. In fact, it was so intimidating that it drove some early thinkers, like Apollinaris, to propose a workaround. They theorized that to avoid creating a second person, perhaps the Word of God simply took on a physical human body, but the divine Word itself replaced the human soul, acting as the animating force.
But Aquinas violently rejects that workaround. If Christ lacked a rational human soul united to a physical human body, he would not meet the basic philosophical definition of a human being.
He would literally just be wearing a biological meat suit animated by a divine spark.
He wouldn't be a man experiencing human life. He would be a divine puppeteer manipulating a human shell. In the logic of salvation, what is not assumed is not healed. If he didn't have a human souls wouldn't be saved.
Precisely. To truly belong to the human species, there must be a genuine union of a rational soul and a physical body. That is non-negotiable. So how does Aquinas solve the puzzle without creating a second person?
This is the genius of the sequence.
He clarifies that yes, the union of soul and body absolutely fully occurs in Christ. However, the sequence of ownership is interrupted. Instead of that soul-body union resulting in a brand new standalone human person, as happens in normal human reproduction, that newly composed human nature is instantaneously, at the microscopic moment of its creation, assumed and united to the already existing person of the Word.
The eternal divine person effectively intercepts the complete human nature at the exact moment of conception, before it has the ontological space to establish its own independent human personality. The divine person takes absolute ownership of it.
Yes. The human nature is drawn up into a far higher, nobler subsistence than it could ever achieve on its own. It does not suffer a loss of dignity by lacking an independent human personality. Rather, it gains infinite, unimaginable dignity by existing directly in the person of the Word.
This precise mechanism of assumption brings us to Article 6. Was the human nature united accidentally?
We must clarify that the word accidentally in scholastic philosophy does not mean by mistake or randomly. In Aristotelian terms, an accident is a characteristic or property that is not essential to the core substance of a thing.
For example, your hair color is an accident. You can dye your hair purple, and you remain essentially human. Your rational animality is your core substance.
The objection he is fighting relies heavily on a quote from the Apostle Paul, who wrote that Christ was in habit found as a man. The Latin word for habit can be translated as clothing or apparel. So the objection asks, is this human nature just a temporary jacket that the divine word put on? Is the incarnation merely an accidental clothing?
If it is merely a jacket, it isn't a genuine ontological union. It's just a costume.
Aquinas uses this question to clearly delineate the narrow tightrope the Orthodox system must walk. On the far left, you have the error of Eutyches, who effectively threw the divine and human natures into a blender, creating a completely new hybrid nature. On the far right, you have Nestorius, who kept the natures so separated that it was basically two different people standing next to each other.
Aquinas argues that the true framework is the middle way.
The union cannot be essential, meaning it did not smash the components into a brand new single nature, but it also cannot be accidental, like a coat of white paint applied to the surface of a brick wall.
So it's midway. The union exists in the subsistence in the hypostasis itself. So how does Aquinas interpret the garment analogy from Paul without reducing it to an accident?
He explains that when a human being puts on a physical garment, the garment is immediately shaped and contoured by the physical figure of the person wearing it. However, the person is completely unchanged internally by the garment.
They don't merge with the jacket.
Applying this to the incarnation, the human nature is fundamentally shaped, elevated, and ennobled by being assumed by the divine word. But the Word of God, the infinite acting agent, remains perfectly internally unchanged. The infinite reality is not altered or constrained by taking on the finite reality.
So what does this all mean as we try to define the final parameters? We are heading into the concluding metaphysical details in question 2, Articles 7 through 9. We have established what the union is not and the exact mechanism of what it is. Now he turns his analytical lens onto the nature of the union itself. Article 7 poses a deeply foundational question. Is the union anything created?
The intuitive, seemingly obvious answer here would be no. Since God is entirely uncreated, and this union involves God directly, shouldn't the union itself share in that uncreated eternal nature?
If the infinite is a core component, the connection must be eternal, right?
That is the trap. Aquinas navigates out of it by relying on a profound philosophical principle regarding relations. He states that any dynamic relationship that exists between God and the created entity is really actually located in the creature.
The relation does not exist in God.
Why? Because of the immovable rule that God does not and cannot change. Therefore, if a brand new relationship begins at a specific point in time, such as the historical event of the incarnation, the change that brings that relationship into existence must occur entirely on the side of the creature.
The creator is the static, eternal pillar of reality. The created being is the one that moves, adapts, and attaches itself to that immovable pillar.
Precisely. Since the union only truly exists within the human nature as it reaches out and relates to God, and since human nature is definitively a created temporal thing, the union itself must be categorized as something created. It had a beginning in time. It is a created relation, bridging the temporal and the eternal.
Article 8 reads almost like a rigid grammar lesson, but in scholastic theology, grammar is the software that runs the metaphysics. The question is simply, is union the exact same thing as assumption?
In a system that relies entirely on precise definitions, words carry immense structural weight. Aquinas differentiates these two terms by categorizing them into action versus relation. If we simplify the terminology, assumption refers to the action, the active, deliberate movement of taking something to oneself. Union refers to the relation, the resulting state or condition of having become united.
And because of this strict categorization, the words must be applied differently to the subjects involved to avoid metaphysical errors. The divine person assumes the human nature. The action vector flows outward from the divine.
The human nature is assumed. It is the passive recipient of the action.
However, both the divine nature and the human nature can accurately be said to be united. The term union simply describes this state without specifying the directionality of the force that caused it. Furthermore, you will never see Aquinas write that the divine nature was assumed by the human nature, because the finite human nature possesses absolutely no capacity to actively grasp or take ownership of the infinite. The divine person is the sole active agent of assumption.
It's the essential grammar of theology. It keeps the power dynamics perfectly oriented. Finally, we reach the summit of this section in Article 9. Having defined every single moving part, he asks, is this the greatest of all possible unions?
It serves as the ultimate concluding evaluation of the system. He tests it against other absolute unities. Is this union greater than basic numerical unity? Is it greater than the profound unity of the divine essence itself, the concept of the Trinity?
His conclusion is incredibly nuanced. He refuses to give a simple yes or no.
Because the truth depends entirely on where you look. He argues that you have to analyze a union from two distinct perspectives. First, you examine the actual items being united. Second, you examine the location or the principle in which they are anchored together.
So if you evaluate the union based on the items themselves, the divine nature and the human nature, they remain infinitely distant from one another.
They do not blend. They do not share essence. So from the perspective of the atoms, this is not the closest possible union because the components remain utterly distinct and unmixed.
But there's a massive pivot when he looks at the anchor point.
Exactly. When you shift your perspective and look at the location of the union, which is the person of the Word, it achieves absolute unassailable preeminence. The unity is perfectly secured within the uncreated, self-subsisting, eternal divine person.
Therefore, because the anchor point of the union is the greatest possible reality in existence, the union of the incarnation is categorized as the greatest of all unions, even though the specific natures being held within that union remain strictly distinct. We have meticulously explored an incredible expanse of logical territory today. Let's take a moment to review the architecture we've mapped out. We started by observing how Aquinas utilizes rigorous sequential logic to prove why the incarnation was entirely fitting.
Demonstrating how supreme goodness inherently actively communicates itself to the farthest reaches of reality.
We analyzed the dual nature of necessity, learning that it wasn't required like food, but profoundly beneficial like a horse, serving to further humanity in faith, hope, and charity, while simultaneously erecting a fortress against pride and evil.
We waded into the deep waters of counterfactuals, determining that within his framework, the scriptural text explicitly frames the event as a targeted remedy for sin, specifically aimed at the extensive, species-wide plague of original sin.
We examined the precise psychology of the timing, recognizing how humanity needed the space to fail under the natural and written laws to shatter its own pride, but required an intervention in the midst of years to prevent total, irreversible moral collapse.
And then we dismantled and rebuilt the mechanics of existence. We proved that the union could not happen by physically blending two natures into a hybrid. Instead, a complete human nature possessing a rational soul and a physical body was perfectly assumed and intercepted at conception by the eternal pre-existing hypostasis of the Word of God.
The natures remain infinitely distinct, but the person acting, suffering, and saving is undeniably one.
It stands as a staggering intellectual achievement to successfully balance variables of infinite power and finite frailty without fracturing the system into logical contradiction or historical heresy. And navigating this intricate system raised a profound thought for me, a final concept for you to mull over as you process all of this. It builds directly on the principle we discussed in Article 7 regarding the union being a created relation.
I am completely ready for the final takeaway.
Aquinas builds a rock-solid case that in any relationship between the infinite and the finite entity is fundamentally altered, elevated, and shaped, while the infinite reality remains perfectly, eternally unchanged. The creator does not change by interacting with the creature. The creature is utterly transformed by interacting with the creator. If we step entirely outside the bounds of strict scholastic theology for a moment and apply this exact metaphysical rule to any intense human pursuit of absolute truth, transcendent beauty, or ultimate meaning in our daily lives, it forces a massive, humbling question. Does our frantic, lifelong search to encounter the absolute ever actually shape or change the absolute? Or does encountering the absolute only, inevitably, and profoundly change us?
That is an incredibly potent thought to walk away with. The pursuit of ultimate reality does not mold the universe to fit our human dimensions. It shatters our dimensions and molds us. Thank you so much for bringing us this source material and joining us on this deep dive into the formidable mind of Thomas Aquinas. We hope this exploration gave your analytical faculties a rigorous workout. Keep defining your terms, keep stress testing your assumptions, and keep exploring the sources. We will catch you next time.